You know, I've always considered myself a reasonable man. A patient one, too. I married Clara thinking we'd face life's storms together, hand in hand, no matter how rough the waters got. But lately, things have been off. Little things at first, missed dinners, an unfamiliar edge in her voice when we talked, and a new, almost frantic energy around her phone. I brushed it off, convinced myself it was just stress from work. After all, Clara's job was demanding, and her boss, Alex, was, by her own admission, a hard man to please. But then came the evening that shattered my illusions. She came home late, disheveled and flushed, like she'd run through a storm. I asked if she was okay, genuinely concerned, but the words that followed froze me in place. She looked me dead in the eye, her lips trembling slightly, and said, "Daniel, I've been having fantasies. About Alex, I don't think I've ever felt anger rise so quickly in me." My jaw clenched and my chest tightened. Fantasies? About her boss? The room felt smaller, hotter. She went on to explain, no, justify, how her thoughts didn't mean she loved me any less. Then, like a dagger to my soul, she suggested something unthinkable. She wanted to bring Alex into our marriage. Not just figuratively. No, Clara thought inviting him into our bedroom would somehow add excitement and strengthen our relationship. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I sat there, stunned, as my mind churned through the implications. Loyalty, respect, vows. All of it felt meaningless in that moment. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with was suggesting something so outrageous, it left me questioning everything. My Clara, my wife. Who was this person sitting across from me? That night, I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of everything Clara had said. Fantasizing about her boss, strengthening our marriage. The words felt alien, like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I thought I knew her, knew us, but in those moments, it felt like our marriage had been living on borrowed time. It wasn't just the idea that she had been entertaining these thoughts. It was her casual attitude about it. The sheer audacity. The next morning, I decided we had to talk. No more brushing it under the rug or pretending everything was fine. Clara walked into the kitchen, her face calm, even cheerful, like last night's conversation hadn't just upended my entire world. She poured herself coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Clara," I said, my voice steady, but every word weighed down by the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "We need to talk." She glanced at me, her brows knitting together in mild concern, but there wasn't an ounce of guilt in her expression. "About what?" she asked, as if she didn't already know. "About Alex. About what you said last night." Her face hardened slightly. She set her mug down and folded her arms, leaning against the counter. "Daniel, I knew you'd overreact. You're making this a bigger deal than it is." "Overreact?" My voice rose, despite my efforts to stay calm. "You told me you've been fantasizing about another man, your boss no less, and you think I'm overreacting?" "It's not what you think," she said, her tone defensive now. "I love you, Daniel. This has nothing to do with love. It's just thoughts. Everyone has them." "Everyone?" I repeated, incredulous. "Clara, there's a difference between a passing thought and whatever this is. You're talking about him like he's some kind of addition to our marriage. And you actually suggested bringing him into our lives, into our bed. Do you hear how insane that sounds?" She sighed, rubbing her temples like I was the unreasonable one. "I'm trying to be honest with you. Isn't that what marriage is about? Honesty? I thought we could explore this together as a couple. It's not about replacing you or anything like that." I stared at her, the woman I had loved for over a decade, now a stranger. "You think this is honesty?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "This isn't honesty, Clara. This is betrayal. You've been fantasizing about another man, and you want me to just be okay with that?" Her composure cracked slightly, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "It's not like I've done anything physical, Daniel. It's all in my head. Can't you see that?" I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face. "Do you hear yourself? You're trying to justify this like it's some harmless daydream. But the moment you shared it with me, the moment you started thinking it could strengthen us, it became real. It stopped being harmless. For a moment, there was silence between us. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, like a thick fog settling over everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you, Daniel, but I need you to understand where I'm coming from." "Understand?" I said, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You want me to understand why you've been emotionally cheating on me? Why you think your boss of all people could somehow fix whatever it is you think is broken between us? I don't need to understand that, Clara. I need you to decide what you want, because I can't live like this." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt, regret, or just frustration that I wasn't playing along with her narrative. She reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I love you. I really do." I stood up, the weight of the conversation too much to bear. "You have a funny way of showing it," I said, heading for the door. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. As I stepped outside, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Alex or her fantasies. This was about respect, loyalty, and everything I thought our marriage stood for. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could come back from this. I don't know how long I stood outside that morning, staring into nothing, my mind racing. But one thing became clear. I needed to confront Alex. I wasn't the type to fight over a woman, much less my own wife. She should have never put me in this position. But I couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about Alex. It was about taking back control of my life, my dignity. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Clara left for work that morning, and I knew Alex would be there. I didn't tell her I was coming, of course. Letting her know would only give her time to run interference, and I wanted this encounter to be as unfiltered as possible. I drove to her office, parked a block away, and waited. It didn't take long. Alex's car, a sleek black SUV that practically screamed arrogance, pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out, dressed like he'd just walked off the set of a men's fashion ad. Tailored suit, designer sunglasses, and that self-assured smirk I already hated. I got out of my car and made a beeline toward him, my footsteps heavy with purpose. "Alex," I called out, my voice cutting through the morning air. He turned, his smirk faltering slightly when he saw me. "Daniel, isn't it?" he said, his tone smooth but guarded. "Clara's husband. Nice to finally meet you." "Nice?" I almost laughed at his audacity. "We need to talk," I said, stopping just a few feet away from him. He tilted his head, still playing the part of the unbothered alpha male. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "You know exactly what's on my mind," I snapped, my fists clenched at my sides. "You've been interfering in my marriage." He raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Interfering? That's a strong word. Clara and I have a professional relationship. If she's told you anything else, well, maybe you should talk to her." His casual dismissal set my blood boiling. "Don't play dumb with me," I growled, stepping closer. "You think you can swoop in and play the charming boss while undermining everything we've built? Let me make this clear. You stay away from Clara. You stay out of my marriage. Do you understand me?" Alex chuckled, a low, condescending sound that made me want to wipe the smug look off his face. "Look, man," he said, spreading his hands like he was the reasonable one. "If your wife's got fantasies, that's between you two. Don't drag me into it." That was it. The last straw. Before I knew it, I had grabbed him by the collar, slamming him back against his car. His sunglasses fell to the ground, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice low and steady, the kind of tone that leaves no room for argument. "You don't come near Clara again. You don't text her, call her, or so much as look at her. If I find out you've even thought about crossing that line again, you'll regret it. Are we clear?" He nodded quickly, his confidence shattered. "Crystal," he muttered, his voice shaky. I let go of him, stepping back as he scrambled to straighten his suit. He glanced at me, then at the building, like he was debating whether to go inside or just leave altogether. Finally, he grabbed his sunglasses, muttered something under his breath, and got into his car. I stood there, watching as he drove off, the roar of his engine fading into the distance. I should have felt victorious, but instead, I was exhausted. The confrontation had taken everything out of me, leaving behind a strange emptiness. This wasn't how I imagined fighting for my marriage. It wasn't supposed to be a fight at all. I had loved Clara fiercely, wholeheartedly, and now here I was, squaring off with another man over her loyalty. As I got back into my car, a nagging thought crept into my mind. Had I just won a battle, or was I fighting a losing war? One thing was certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. When Clara got home that evening, I was sitting in the living room, my arms crossed and my jaw tight. She walked in, setting her bag down like it was any other day. But the second she looked at me, she knew something was off. "Daniel?" she asked cautiously. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "Clara, I confronted Alex today." Her face went pale and she froze, halfway through pulling off her shoes. "You... what?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I went to your office, Clara. I spoke to him, and I made it clear that he's to stay away from you and our marriage." I stood up, my anger barely contained. "You should have seen him. This so-called alpha male was shaking by the time I was done." Her eyes widened in a mix of shock and anger. "Daniel, how could you? That's my workplace. Do you have any idea how this could affect me, my reputation?" "Your reputation?" I laughed bitterly. "That's what you're worried about? Not the fact that you've been emotionally cheating on me? Not the fact that you dragged our marriage into the mud the moment you thought it was okay to fantasize about your boss and invite him into our lives?" She flinched at my words, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "I already told you, Daniel, it wasn't physical. I love you, and I never stopped loving you. I don't know. I was curious, okay? I thought being honest about it would help us." "Honest?" I shot back. "This isn't honesty, Clara. This is betrayal. You've been fantasizing about another man, confiding in him, and then you had the nerve to ask me to explore this together? Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't sure if they were from guilt, shame, or anger at being confronted. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've made mistakes, but it's not what you think. I never meant to hurt you. I thought—" "You thought what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "That I'd just go along with it? That I'd share you with some smug jerk who thinks he's better than me? Clara, you've disrespected me in ways I didn't think were possible. And now, you want to play the victim?" "I'm not playing anything," she cried, the tears now streaming down her face. "I've been trying to fix this, Daniel. I've been trying to find a way to make us stronger." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed just how far apart we'd grown. "You don't fix a marriage by inviting a third person into it, Clara," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You fix it by respecting each other, by communicating, by working through the tough times together, not by turning to someone else for attention." She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I feel like I've ruined everything." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. I could see she was hurting, but her pain didn't erase mine. It didn't change the fact that she'd shattered my trust. You're right, I said after a long silence. You have ruined everything, and I don't know if we can come back from this. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. No, Daniel, please, don't say that. I love you. I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what to do. I shook my head, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I don't think this is something you can fix with words, Clara. I need time. I need space to figure out what this means for us, if there even is an us anymore. Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't move to comfort her. For the first time in our marriage, I felt completely disconnected from her, like we were two strangers sharing the same space. I left her there on the couch and walked upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind me. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, I realized that this wasn't just about Alex or her fantasies. It was about everything those fantasies represented. The cracks in our foundation, the unspoken resentments, and the distance that had grown between us. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I had the strength or the desire to try to repair what was broken. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. The events of the past few days had taken their toll, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize or compartmentalize, one fact remained glaringly clear. Something fundamental between Clara and me was broken. Maybe it had been for a while, and I'd just been too blind, or too hopeful to see it. Clara was already awake when I came downstairs. She was sitting at the dining table, clutching a mug of coffee, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up at me with a kind of desperation that made my stomach twist. "Daniel," she started softly, "I've been thinking—" "Don't," I interrupted, raising a hand. "Not right now. I need to say something first." She froze, her fingers tightening around the mug. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, too. About us. About everything that's happened. And I can't do this anymore, Clara, not like this." Her eyes widened in alarm. "Daniel, please don't say that. We can work through this. I know we can." I shook my head, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. "I don't think we can. Trust, respect, loyalty, those aren't things you can just patch up overnight. What you did, what you suggested, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. A series of choices that told me exactly where I stand in your priorities." She stood up, tears streaming down her face. "You're my priority, Daniel. You're my husband. I love you." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You keep saying that, but love isn't enough, Clara. Love doesn't fix betrayal. Love doesn't erase the fact that you invited someone else into our marriage, emotionally, if not physically. You broke something in us, and I don't think it can be put back together." Her knees buckled, and she sank back into the chair. "So that's it?" she whispered. "You're just giving up?" "Giving up?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Clara, I'm not the one who gave up. You gave up the moment you started turning to Alex instead of me. You gave up the moment you thought it was okay to disrespect everything we've built together." She looked at me with pleading eyes, but I forced myself to keep going. "I need to do this for myself, Clara, for my sanity, for my self-respect. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. So I'm asking you to pack your things." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words hit her. "You're kicking me out?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm asking you to leave," I clarified, my tone firm but not unkind. "We both need space to figure out where we go from here. If we go anywhere at all." For a moment, she just sat there, staring at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then, slowly, she stood up. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking. "If that's what you want, I'll go. But just know this, Daniel. I never stopped loving you. No matter what you think, that hasn't changed." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Love wasn't the issue. It was everything else. I watched as she went upstairs to pack, her sobs echoing faintly down the hallway. Part of me wanted to follow her, to hold her and tell her we'd figure it out. But another part of me, a stronger, more resolute part, knew that would only delay the inevitable. When she came back down with her suitcase, she paused at the door, looking at me one last time. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know." And then she was gone. The door closed behind her, and with it, a chapter of my life I'd never imagined would end this way. As I stood there in the deafening silence of our home, I felt an odd mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we'd lost, but relief for the clarity I'd gained. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But this was just the beginning. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was a journey I had to take. Alone. The first few days after Clara left felt like I was living in a fog. The house was too quiet, too still. Every room seemed to echo with memories of her. The scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom, the sound of her laugh in the kitchen, even the way she always left her shoes by the door despite me asking her a million times not to. It all hit me in waves: anger, sadness, guilt, and then back to anger again. But I couldn't let myself wallow. I knew if I stayed in that house, surrounded by the remnants of a broken marriage, I'd never move on. So I made a decision. I packed a bag, threw it in the trunk of my car, and hit the road. No plan, no destination, just me, the open road, and a need to escape. The first few days were tough. I didn't feel free, not yet. I just felt lost. But as the miles stretched out behind me, something started to shift. The physical distance from Clara, from our house, from the life we'd built together. It gave me a kind of mental clarity I hadn't had in weeks. For the first time, I could think without the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. I stopped in small towns along the way, places where no one knew me, where I could just be a guy passing through. I'd sit in diners, nursing a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of conversations around me. I'd hike trails I'd never heard of before, letting the quiet of the woods drown out the noise in my head. And slowly, I started to feel like myself again. One night, I found myself parked at a roadside motel somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I sat on the hood of my car, staring up at the stars. It was a clear night, the kind where the sky feels impossibly big, and for the first time in a long time, I felt small, in a good way. Like my problems, my anger, my heartbreak were just tiny specks in the grand scheme of things. It was humbling, but also comforting. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I wrote in a journal. It wasn't much, just a few lines about how I was feeling, but it was enough to remind me of who I was before all of this. Before the marriage, before Clara, before Alex, and everything that came after. It was like meeting an old friend I hadn't seen in years. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was getting there. I realized that my worth wasn't tied to Clara's actions or her betrayal. It wasn't tied to my anger or my pain either. My worth was mine, and mine alone. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing what came next. I was just living, one day at a time, 1 mile at a time. And that, I realized, was enough. Somewhere in the middle of my aimless journey, I stumbled upon a small desert town. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving by. Dusty streets, a few scattered buildings, and an old diner with a flickering neon sign that simply read, Eve's. I hadn't planned on stopping, but something about the name caught my attention. Or maybe I was just hungry and tired. Either way, I parked the car and stepped inside. The diner was quiet, save for the low hum of a jukebox playing some country song I didn't recognize. It smelled of coffee and freshly baked pie, a combination that felt oddly comforting. Behind the counter was a woman, her back to me as she filled a pot with water. She turned when she heard the door close, and that was the first time I saw her, Eve. She wasn't what I expected. Not that I'd expected anything in particular, but she had this air about her, a mix of confidence and ease that was hard to ignore. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore a simple apron over a sundress. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and maybe that's what impressed me most. "Take a seat anywhere," she said, her voice warm but no nonsense. "Menu's on the table, but the coffee's strong, and the pie's better than anything else you'll find in this town." I smiled despite myself. "Sounds like you're pretty confident in your pie." She raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "I am." I slid into a booth near the window, and before I even opened the menu, she was there with a mug of coffee and a slice of pie. "Trust me," she said, setting it down in front of me. "This is what you need." She wasn't wrong. The pie was incredible. But what struck me more was Eve herself. As the hours passed, I found myself lingering longer than I had intended. We talked about the town, about her diner, about life in general. She had a way of making you feel at ease, like nothing you said could surprise her, and nothing she said was meant to impress you. She was just real. I ended up staying in that town for longer than I planned. Part of me told myself it was the peace and quiet that kept me there. But deep down, I knew it was Eve. She had this energy about her, independent, unfiltered, and utterly unbothered by life's chaos. She didn't ask me why I was there or pry into my past, and I appreciated that. I wasn't ready to share, and she seemed to understand that without me having to say a word. Over time, we grew closer. She showed me around the town, introducing me to the small handful of locals who made up its population. She even got me to help out at the diner when her usual cook called in sick. It was simple work, flipping pancakes and washing dishes, but it felt good to be useful. It felt good to be normal. One evening, after the diner had closed and the desert sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, we sat on the porch of her small house, sharing a bottle of wine. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "most people who come through this town are running from something." I glanced at her, caught off guard by her sudden insight. "What makes you think I'm any different?" I asked. She shrugged, a knowing smile on her lips. "You don't talk like someone running away. You talk like someone trying to figure out where they're supposed to go next." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't wrong. I wasn't just running from Clara or the wreckage of my marriage. I was searching for peace, for clarity, for a version of myself I'd lost along the way. And in that moment, sitting next to Eve under the desert sky, I felt like I'd found a piece of it. The days in that quiet desert town began to stretch into weeks. Every morning started the same way. A cup of coffee at Eve's diner, her quick wit waking me up faster than the caffeine ever could. Every evening ended with us sitting on her porch, staring at the vast desert sky. It was a rhythm I didn't expect to find comfort in, but I did. It felt natural, simple, like I was peeling back the layers of who I used to be before life got so damn complicated. Eve was nothing like Clara. She didn't carry the weight of other people's expectations on her shoulders. She lived unapologetically, taking each day as it came. And somehow, without even trying, she started to challenge the way I saw myself. One afternoon, while the diner was slow, she handed me a rag and pointed at the tables. "You're not just going to sit there looking pretty," she teased. "Help me out." I laughed, but took the rag anyway. It was the first time in a while that I felt useful. I wiped tables, refilled coffee cups, and even made a mess of flipping burgers on the griddle. Eve just laughed and told me I was a work in progress. But the truth was, I didn't mind being a work in progress. For once, it felt okay not to have it all figured out, It wasn't just the work, though. It was the way Eve saw the world, through a lens of possibility rather than regret. She didn't care about my past, didn't press for details about Clara or why I was wandering through her tiny corner of the world. She only cared about the person I was becoming, not the person I'd been. One evening, after closing the diner, she took me out to a stretch of land she said was her favorite spot. It was nothing but desert, sand stretching out as far as the eye could see. But when the sun began to set, the entire landscape lit up in shades of gold and crimson. "This," she said, gesturing to the horizon, "is what I come here for, a reminder that even the harshest places have their beauty." Her words stuck with me. Maybe I'd been looking at my life all wrong, focusing on the pain, the betrayal, the things I'd lost, instead of seeing the beauty in what was still there. We spent more time together after that, not as strangers or even friends, but as two people helping each other rediscover what it meant to feel alive. She took me hiking through canyons, taught me how to cook more than just eggs, and even convinced me to join her in fixing up the old jukebox in the diner. Each moment felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost. Through Eve, I started to see that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about finding something stronger to hold on to. And in her carefree laugh, in the way she faced the world with open arms, I found a kind of strength I hadn't known I needed. But it wasn't just about her. It was about what she brought out in me. For the first time in years, I started to let go of the anger and bitterness that had consumed me. I stopped looking at my reflection and seeing a man who'd been betrayed. Instead, I saw someone who had endured, who had chosen to keep going even when it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Even I didn't talk about the future much. We didn't need to. We were both content to live in the moment, to let life unfold however it chose. She taught me that it was okay not to have all the answers, that sometimes the journey was more important than the destination. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The day I decided to leave the desert town, it felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. I woke up with that familiar ache in my chest, the kind that comes when you know a chapter is closing. My bag was already packed, and my car was gassed up and ready to go. But there was still one person I needed to see before I left. Eve. The diner was quiet when I walked in, just the hum of the jukebox playing an old tune. Eve was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot like she always did when she was deep in thought. She looked up when the doorbell chimed, her face breaking into that warm smile I'd come to know so well. "Morning," she said, her voice as easy as ever. "You're up early." I slid into my usual booth, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, figured I'd get a head start today." She set a cup of coffee in front of me without asking, just like she always did. But this time she lingered, her hands resting on the edge of the counter as she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, it's time." She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked like she'd been expecting it. "Figured as much," she said with a small smile. "You've had that look in your eye the past few days, like a bird getting ready to leave the nest." I laughed lightly, though the sound felt hollow. "Is it that obvious?" She shrugged, leaning back against the counter. "Not to most people, but I've seen enough wanderers pass through here to know when someone's found what they were looking for." I sipped my coffee, letting her words sink in. She was right. I hadn't realized it until now, but in this little town, in this old diner, I had found something. Clarity, peace, maybe even a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. And a big part of that was because of Eve. "You've helped me more than you know," I said finally, setting the mug down. "I don't think I can ever repay you for that." She waved a hand dismissively. "You don't owe me anything, Daniel. You did the hard work. I just gave you a place to catch your breath." I stood, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small tip to leave on the counter. But when I turned to go, she called out after me, "Wait, I paused, looking back at her. She walked around the counter and stood in front of me, her eyes searching mine. "Wherever you're going," she said, her voice steady, "don't look back. You're stronger than you think, and you've got a lot of life left to live. Don't waste it holding on to things that are already gone." I nodded, her words hitting me harder than I cared to admit. "Thank you, Eve, for everything." She smiled, reaching out to squeeze my hand briefly. "Take care of yourself, Daniel, and don't be a stranger." With that, I walked out of the diner and into the warm desert morning. The air was still, the kind of quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. As I got into my car and pulled onto the road, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, sadness, hope. Eve had been right about one thing. I was leaving with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't know exactly where the road would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving forward. As the diner faded into the distance in my rearview mirror, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The past was behind me now. Ahead of me was a future I was finally ready to face. As the miles stretched out behind me, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought me to this moment. The journey wasn't just about the physical distance I'd put between myself and the life I'd left behind. It was about the emotional road I'd traveled, the lessons I'd learned along the way. Clara's betrayal had broken something in me. It had shattered the trust, the bond we'd built over years of marriage. At first, all I could feel was anger, raw and consuming. But as time passed, I realized that holding on to that anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. It wasn't hurting Clara. It was only hurting me. Eve had helped me see that, though she probably didn't even realize it. Her carefree spirit and grounded perspective reminded me that life doesn't stop because of one heartbreak or even 1,000. She taught me that healing isn't about erasing the pain, but learning how to carry it without letting it define you. And in the quiet moments we shared, I found a clarity I hadn't known I needed. Looking back, I could see how Clara and I had drifted apart long before Alex came into the picture. Maybe we'd gotten too comfortable, too complacent. Maybe we'd stopped seeing each other as partners and started seeing each other as obligations. I wasn't blameless in that. I could admit that now. But her choices, they were hers alone, and they forced me to confront the reality of our marriage in a way I never wanted to. Now, as I drove into the horizon with no clear destination, I felt lighter. Not because I'd forgotten or forgiven, but because I'd finally let go of the need to control what came next. The past was a heavy weight to carry, but I'd learned how to set it down piece by piece with every mile I drove. I thought about Eve, her laugh, her unwavering confidence, her ability to see through the layers of my pain without judgment. She was a fleeting chapter in my life, but her impact was anything but fleeting. She taught me to live in the moment, to embrace the unknown, and to see the beauty in imperfection. In many ways, she reminded me of who I used to be before life got so complicated. And then there was me, Daniel, the man who had once been defined by a marriage, by the expectations of what life should look like. Now I was just Daniel, a man who had been broken but had found the strength to rebuild. A man who had faced betrayal and come out on the other side, scarred, but not defeated. A man who was ready to live again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I pulled over to the side of the road. I stepped out of the car and stood there, staring at the vast expanse of desert stretching out before me. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small in the best possible way. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let the past define me. I wouldn't let fear or anger or regret hold me back. I would move forward, not perfectly, not without stumbles, but with purpose. Because life is messy and unpredictable, but it's also beautiful and worth fighting for. As I got back into the car and started driving again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just hope for what lay ahead, but hope for who I was becoming. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited to see where the road would take me next.